Hello and welcome to House Call. I'm Dr. Rueben Brock. We have with us today a very special guest, my wife, Darra.
Hi.
Thank you for being on the show. My wife is always on set. She's always somewhere around whenever we are shooting, but this is obviously the first time you're here on camera. We are celebrating the newest addition of our family. About a month ago, our baby girl was born, baby Ella. But the process of bringing Ella into our family was one that really opened up my eyes to something I had never really thought about, never really understood, and that is infertility. It took us 6 years from when we started attempting to have a baby to when Ella was born. And the process was something that I just had never experienced and didn't think anything of, but was really eye-opening to me. What it was like for you attempting to have a baby and how difficult it was. And so I wanted to be able to talk about it with the world. And you, throughout this process, did a lot of research and were able to kind of teach me a lot of this. And one of the things that I thought was most striking was that 1 in 8 couples, according to the CDC, 1 in 8 couples experience infertility issues, and something like 12% of women, over 7 million, who are attempting to have a baby are in some sort of infertility treatment. That is a lot of people.
Yes.
It's a far more common issue than most people probably, or at least men, would understand. What do you think about why it's so common and yet not talked about?
I think because of the emotional struggle, it's easy for women to think that it is their fault or something that makes them feel less of a woman when they can't conceive a baby, because that seems to be the one thing a woman is supposed to be able to do. So it's difficult to discuss that with others, especially when you have people around you that are able to conceive naturally,
Right.
quickly. It's difficult because you're bringing the conversation down, or you're being very, very vulnerable to somebody that may or may not be interested in hearing your story.
Yeah. And one of the things that I saw early on that was really difficult, and I honestly often didn't even know how to handle it, was when you're around people who are getting pregnant, having babies, and then there's you kind of quietly exiting the room to go cry. I talked to other women and found out how common that is, that someone's announcing their pregnancy or announcing the birth of their child, and it is so difficult emotionally for someone who is in the midst of infertility issues.
Baby showers, all of those things are a very hard thing to go through, but you want to be happy for the people that are important to you, obviously,
Yeah.
and you are happy for them, but it's hard not to think about your struggle and what you're going through at the time.
Right, and you already talked about this, but the fact that there's not a ton of support for it because you're naturally just not telling everyone
Sure.
about what you're going through. So if you're struggling to get pregnant, that's not something you bring up as easily as, "Hey, I'm pregnant."
Or trying to get pregnant.
Yeah.
When you know that you have a struggle. So it's opening that door and feeling more free to speak on it, but then that means that people also have to be a little bit more receptive to hearing. It's like when you ask somebody, "How are you today?" Typically someone's not going to say, "I'm having a terrible day. This is
Right,
the worst day
right,
ever."
right.
You're going to say, "I'm doing good."
Right.
And,
Even if
and
you're
kind
not.
of keep moving on.
Yeah.
That is just culturally the way we tend to communicate.
And so you're saying if someone asks you how it's going, you're not going to say, "Well, we're really struggling with this pregnancy thing." That's just not something you would say.
Right. Well, it depends on who you're speaking to, and how you think it would be received, but you just don't know, and it's a personal decision and a personal preference, and I think it depends on who you're speaking to.
Yeah.
I tend to be a little bit more candid
Yeah.
than most, but you also just have to think of whether or not it's appropriate, right?
Right.
If you're speaking to somebody that's younger than you, or you just
Right.
don't know.
Right.
You may have to change your approach.
It seems to me, I could be wrong, but my perception is that there is some degree of shame
Absolutely.
associated with being unable to get pregnant. And I hope that I can say that that's not a good thing, right?
Absolutely.
That's not rightfully so, but there is some shame culturally.
Yes.
It's like women are supposed to be able to have a baby.
In the same way that they say women are supposed to want to have children, not every woman wants to have a baby.
Yeah.
But at the very least, there is a perception that a woman should be able to conceive a baby. So there is shame associated with it. When you are using assistive reproductive techniques like IVF, in vitro fertilization, or intrauterine insemination, which is IUI, sometimes morally people have a problem with that. They think that you're playing God.
Right, you're doing something wrong.
Right. So there, sometimes you don't want to have those conversations because somebody could come back to you and say that you're playing God, or if you were supposed to have a baby, then you would have a baby. Why are you
so now you're going to be
circumventing
judged
the process? Right.
Yeah.
So if you don't even want to entertain what somebody else's opinion is, you just don't give them the opportunity to shame you. So then you're shamed for not being able to conceive naturally, and then you're shamed for doing what you need to do to have a baby that way. Or why don't you just adopt? There are so many babies out here that need families. Why would you go through some medical or scientific intervention when you could just adopt? You have those comments that you sometimes aren't in the mood for.
Right, because you're already going through something that's difficult.
You're already a little bit fragile.
And then someone is going to, on top of all that, judge you for how you're handling it.
Yes.
Yeah. And you brought up IVF. The average cost for IVF is over $12,000. And you and I talked about this as we went through this process, how prohibitive the cost of it is, and the fact that most of the time insurance doesn't cover it. And I thought to myself, and you and I have talked about, what does a family without the means to do that? What do they do? I mean, it's just one of those really, really difficult scenarios where cost can be a significant barrier. If you don't have the means to either shell out or borrow 13 grand for one round of IVF, it may take you out of the realm of even having a baby.
Absolutely. And IVF is not guaranteed to work.
Right.
What people don't understand is sometimes adoption is equally as expensive.
Right, which is what we found.
Yeah.
Right.
So it is. And for most, IVF is the end of the line. So IVF costs more than $12,000, but chances are you have already spent a good bit of money to get to the point where you're willing to say IVF is what we're turning to.
Right.
So what do couples do? You know, they take out loans, they borrow against 401ks, they borrow from families, or they are not, or unfortunately. There are grants and things available, but it is cost prohibitive if your insurance doesn't cover it, which it typically does not. You know, infertility is not always at the top of the list. There are several institutions that do, you know, Starbucks, Bank of America. So when you're in this life, you start to research and think about career changes.
That was one of the things that I thought was funny. In the midst of this process, my wife would research the different companies that would pay for fertility treatment or IVF, and legitimately considered changing careers so that she could be at a place that would cover this, because one, it's so expensive.
Yes.
And two, it's such an important thing in your life. If you want to have a baby, it's you know, pretty high, or maybe at the top of your list of life priorities. And so you change careers in order to be able to do it. If you don't have the money, you're going to find a company that would pay for it, go work for them because you want a baby that bad.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow. And so one of the other things that I thought was interesting in doing the research for this, roughly a third of infertility is simply unexplained. Like, you and I knew why we were having these issues, but there are couples out there who are having these issues and they don't even know why.
Yes, and I don't know the percentage, but there's something called secondary infertility, where you conceive a baby naturally as a couple and then the second one.
Yeah.
And a family that we're very, very close to experienced that, and then they have to figure that out, and they have unexplained secondary infertility.
Right.
So you can imagine the comments that you would receive that way. Thank God that you have one baby. Why would you
Right. Oh, right.
go
Right.
through
You've
all
already
of this
got
to
one.
have a second?
What's your issue?
And
Yeah.
that's really
Yeah.
not the right approach, in my opinion.
And my goal on this show is always to help people. And one of the things that you and I have talked about and that I struggle with is the culture surrounding this. Like, there's shame involved with this. There is a problem in our culture where we don't talk about this. What would you want to see change in order to make this better?
Yeah. I think the answer is the same for anything that we want to make better culturally, which is have these discussions and talk about it freely. Generally, it's human nature for people to have an aversion to things that they don't understand or don't know anything about. So the more conversations that we are having and making it so that when people do have a problem morally with the way you've conceived your child, if you speak to somebody who, may have gone through chemotherapy at a young age and can't conceive a baby, or has PCOS, when you think about the circumstances behind why it's so important to them or why they would want to have a baby, you may think differently.
You start to understand it.
Exactly.
When you are talking to and hearing the stories of people who you care about,
right,
and who have a story that you can understand. Oh, I get it now,
right,
why you did that.
But you have to be willing to have those conversations. So it's kudos to the women like Michelle Obama, who are now speaking freely about their fertility struggles. Both of the Obama children were conceived using IVF. That came out in her most recent book. That kind of made it so that more people feel like they can. But it's not just celebrities. It's the person next door to you.
Right.
When I became open about our story,
we started to hear the floodgates opened up. We hear all these different people who experienced it
that are very close to us.
Yeah. So I had no idea how common a miscarriage it was or is until we had one. And then all of a sudden, every woman I talk to has their story about having a miscarriage.
Yes. And it's hard to find support until you open up. So, you have to be just as brave as the other person in the conversation.
Right.
But suffering from a loss, that's when you need the most help.
Right.
And if you're not saying to anybody and you're just going to work and carrying on your life, you don't have the ability to have somebody say, take the day off, or don't show up, or I'm just going to come over and watch TV. We don't have to talk about it, whatever it is, send flowers. But if you don't know
that it's happening. Right. So somebody's going through infertility. Someone just had a miscarriage. 9 times out of 10, their closest friends don't even know. And so changing that would be changing the culture surrounding these issues so that it can be talked about openly.
Yes.
And we remove the shame.
Right.
And it's so interesting for me as a man to understand and attempt to navigate how this works, because for me, I hesitate to talk about this stuff with anyone because I don't want to be telling your story. You know what I mean? And so, yes, kudos to the Michelle Obamas of the world who are willing to tell this story, and kudos to you. Thank you for being willing. I hope that we have shed a little bit of light for people on what it's like, and showing that everyday folks, your next door neighbor, may have experienced this. And I would encourage people to just keep that in mind when you are talking about fertility, when you're talking about the fact that you are pregnant now and you're celebrating. There may very well be somebody sitting right beside you who is both happy for you but also dying inside because they are struggling to become pregnant.
Yes.
And that is something that I would have never understood until I got to see it firsthand.
Yeah, infertility strikes you mentally, physically, and emotionally.
Yeah.
And it's really tough. And
I see you getting them just talking about it.
But through my struggles, when I got pregnant and since we've had the baby, it's hard for me to even be vocal on social media for that very reason. I thought that I was going to share my pregnancy and I couldn't because I felt so much for the women who are still in the struggle.
Yeah.
So I don't post as many pictures, and it's tough.
Because you're thinking about all the women you know
who
now.
haven't gotten there yet.
Yeah. Wow. That's heavy. I would have never even considered that until you just said it, because you're now in these groups of women who have infertility issues. And so there's some degree of, you feel for them.
Yes.
And so you can't just say, hey, look at my baby.
We took weekly pictures and haven't shared them.
Right.
You know, I would never want to be that source of pain for somebody close to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. And so I hope that this maybe sheds light for someone who doesn't know this. And I just thank you for being willing to share this story. I would have never seen it until we do this together. And so, hopefully it sheds light for others to be compassionate to those who are struggling, mothers in waiting.
Yeah.
It's a much bigger deal than I would have ever imagined. So that's all we've got for today. If you have a thought about this, or if you want to share your story, please share it in the comments on YouTube, on Facebook. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that you know when episodes are coming out. Again, thanks to our special guest, my lovely wife. And my heart goes out to those who are not yet where we are. We have our wonderful, healthy baby Ella, and that made this 6-year process, and all the time and the money and the tears, it made it all worth it. But I know that there are people out there who aren't there yet. So our hearts are with you. So I'm Dr. Rueben Brock. This is House Call.